Okay, welcome to this our first keynote session, which I've been looking forward very much to myself. It's Dan Ross, who had joined us from Australia, a very long way from, but would come virtually and tell us, give a presentation on Dare to Think Past the Anthropocene, what is to be done with education. Before we get into this, and before I present Dan, first a piece of practical information. You will all have received an email here from our conference systems. It might not apply to you because you are obviously here. There has been a few people who had difficulties using the links. If you hear from any of them, refer to this email because it tells them how to get in. But it's only a few, but we would like to have everybody on board. So if you hear anybody asking you about this, then please enlighten them. Okay, that being said, we will hear this keynote from Dan, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Dan is a philosopher, and he's also has also made a very good movie called the Ister, and he has recently published a book which is called it's called Psychopolitical Anaphylaxis, Steps Towards a Metacosmics. And we will probably hear more about this, but before we get into this, I will say a little more about Dan. Just a second, we will get into this, so I don't forget some of the stuff I'll say. Okay, Dan is trained as a philosopher and has been writing on Heidegger and Derrida and French philosophy, and especially the late Bernard Stiegler, who has also been working close together with, and he has also translated many of his works. Besides this, he has also made I don't know, you call it a philosophical road movie. That might be the wrong expression. A philosophical river movie called The Ister, which is about the Danube, and it's taking its starting point from lectures the German philosopher Heidegger did on the German poet Hölderlin, who has made a poem on called The Ister, when we translate it into English. And it's a very beautiful movie and highly recommendable. It's kind of slow ride through the movie up to where the spring, where it comes, where it starts. And at the same time, you have the interviews with philosophers, among them also Bernard Stiegler. And one could ask, what is this all about? This has something to do with memory, techne, and aesthetics, and the question of being. There's a lot of different themes built into this movie, and you will recognize this also when you hear Dan talking with the philosophers, but also reading his translation of Stiegler and what he is doing himself to further develop the tradition from Stiegler. And you could say this Dan is also what he's doing is very relevant for this conference, because he's both writing about the Anthropocene, also about techne is a very main topic, but also the digital and cybernetics, the concept of information, as well as aesthetics and the idea of being human, or how we should put it. Dan will explain that better than I will in a moment. So it's a kind of mixing a total new ways of thinking about these questions, and also new ways of framing the question of the Anthropocene as the Anthropocene. So it's a very broad-minded and a very original work philosophy we will hear, and we will also I will definitely recommend this book, Psychopolitical Anaphylaxis, Steps Toward a Metacosmics, which has been published at Open Humanities Press this year, 2021. So I think this would be the introduction, and you can fill in whatever I forgot, and I probably a lot, but the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Jesper. Thank you very much. Excellent job there. And I don't think I need to add to it now. Some of those things will be discussed and some of them not so much in this paper, but we'll have some time for discussion at the end, I think. So hopefully we can cover everything that we need to cover as well as we can within the time. You can see the slideshow, yeah? Yeah, okay, good. Normally I don't like to just read a text, but in this case I have a lot of slides and I think it might be for the best. So I'll just begin. Being invited to reflect on the relationship between education, diversity, and sustainability in the context of the years 2030 and 2050, it's obvious that these are the two dates identified in the famous special report on anthropogenic climate change released by the IPCC in October 2018, where it was argued that the world must limit global warming to less than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. As you're no doubt aware, the UN body concluded that the achievement of this goal requires global net anthropogenic CO2 emissions to be reduced by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 and to zero by 2050. 2.5 years later, where do we stand? Well, in March 2021, a report by the Australian Academy of Science stated that limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees is now virtually impossible. And research published in Nature in February claimed that on current trends, the probability of staying below 2 degrees of warming is only 5%. But if all countries meet their nationally determined contributions and continue to reduce emissions at the same rate after 2030, it rises to 26%. Finally, a report released just a few days ago by the Australian Climate Council concludes that multiple lines of evidence strongly suggest that we can no longer limit warming to 1.5 degrees without significant overshoot and subsequent drawdown, and that the global average temperature rise will exceed 1.5 degrees during the 2030s. These are reports and pieces of research that I've selected. Other selections would have been possible, and indeed other researchers have different assessments of the likelihood of various outcomes. And the next IPCC report isn't due until next year. So you're not obliged to believe that 1.5 degrees is impossible, or that there's only a 5% chance of staying below 2 degrees. What is obligatory is to recognize that all statements about goals, intentions, targets, aspirations, commitments, promises, expectations, hopes, or dreams have to be seen in the context of a CO2 emissions reality that to this point consists in nothing but year-on-year increases in the number of billions of tons of carbon being released into the atmosphere, as the following two graphs make plain. That claim that all statements about and relationships to the future have to be seen in the context of present trends may sound unduly pessimistic and not terribly philosophical, projecting a possible future only on the basis of a feeling about present difficulties. Nevertheless, philosophy today can no longer pretend to be divorced from science or technology. Philosophers must take account of this dire scientific probability, but in a way that genuinely tries to respond to it as an emergency, and not just as an excuse, either for further chatter or for proclaiming that the time for thinking or theorizing is past. What is absent are precisely the concepts by which we can understand this failure and begin to address it by aiming at the improbable, if not the virtually impossible. If philosophers have nothing meaningful to say about this, then why should anyone bother to listen to them? If then, I nonetheless hope that you'll continue to give me your attention from the other side of your little screens It can only be because I believe that there is, in the context of this emergency, something worth saying about the relationship between education and sustainability. Whether that belief is justified is something it'll be up to you to judge, and the way in which it will be judged is by knowing what difference it makes to how you see what is to be done and what you do. The worst would be to indulge in a talk fest that ultimately just apes the blather of politicians and other powerful figures for whom responsibility does not seem to consist in matching claimed intentions to actions. Yet nor could taking responsibility consist in maintaining a posture of resistance. What matters is not to resist, but rather to think and to care about how to invent. To think about how to invent. For this, we absolutely require an assessment of the present situation. Such an assessment must not just calculate probabilities, but must be a critique, understood as that which is called for by a crisis. In the case of climate change, we must begin by acknowledging that this is only one limit towards which the biosphere and globalization seem to be headed, one among many, where each of these limits combines with others in a precipitating way, and where addressing one of these limits always risks accelerating the headlong rush into the others. In the case of all these limits of contemporary atmospheric, ecological, technical, and social systems, the starting point for critique must be, it seems to me, to recognize that ultimately there are only really three possible attitudes towards this crisis. The first attitude consists in concluding that the emergency has gone beyond the point where catastrophe can be avoided. Thresholds have been crossed, tipping points reached, and no significant difference can any longer be made. This is to say that there's no longer any collective horizon of a belief in a good future for the systems that form the matrix of our existence, leading to a fatalistic attitude that corresponds to nihilism. Nothing is possible, therefore everything is permitted. To call this nihilism does not prove that it is false, and it may in fact correspond to the most probable truth of our contemporary situation. Yet to content ourselves with doing no more than adapting to the probable is to accept that this catastrophe is bound to fall upon the heads and shoulders of our children and our children's children. And so if we do not wish to confine ourselves to tending our own garden as the forest burns, then we are bound to consider the alternatives, however improbable. The second attitude corresponds to a vision to which the world's public and private powers have pinned their hopes. The vision according to which it is possible to modify the relationship of the technical and social systems to the atmospheric, geological, and biological systems of the planet, and to do so without fundamentally transforming the economic model that articulates the exchanges occurring within and between these technical and social systems and that pollutes these atmospheric and ecological systems. This is the notion that it's possible to take care of terrestrial and human life by decoupling production and consumption from the carbonization of the atmosphere. And presumably that such decoupling can be extended to all of the other poisons and harms that afflict and threaten the biosphere. On the one hand, this fantasy runs up against the reality that emissions have done nothing but rise, that habitat has done nothing but shrink, that biodiversity has done nothing but decrease. On the other hand, the very same fantasy serves to justify the ongoing refusal to examine or respond to the systemic causes of these trends. What ultimately perpetuates this situation is the quite possibly justified fear that despite assurances that we really can do this and it isn't that hard, despite being cajoled with the idea that acting now will be much cheaper than having to do more later, in fact, to really reduce emissions to zero, reverse the loss of habitat, and stem the reduction of biodiversity would entail a very significant risk to the global economy and could bring who knows what unforeseeable consequences ranging from famine to authoritarianism to global war. Before dismissing this fear as alarmist, we should reflect on the idea that lies behind such a decoupling, which is the proposition that a global economic system whose economic sustainability depends on a constant and never-ending increase of consumption can be maintained ad infinitum while simultaneously reducing non-renewable energy consumption to zero, and all this without continuing to destroy habitat and biodiversity. Doing justice to the improbability of such a decoupling, or in other words, applying what Jacques Derrida called the aporia of justice to this aporia of sustainability, as I've previously called it, forces us to raise the necessity of a third attitude, which is to consider the real possibility that this global macroeconomic model has reached its limit. When any system reaches its limit, the alternatives are either that it collapses or that through a transitional and transformational process, it facilitates more or less violently the opening of another system, which in this case means another macroeconomic model articulating the relationship between the technical system and social systems, along with the geological, atmospheric, and biological systems of the Earth's biosphere. Such transitional transformations are neither impossible nor new. They occur historically whenever a disadjustment between the technical system and the social systems is successfully negotiated. Collapses do occur, but they're not bound to occur. But then we must add, if in this case a collapse is to be avoided, it depends on the existence of individual, collective, institutional, and organizational will and intelligence capable of negotiating such a transformation. Furthermore, if 1.5 degrees really is slipping from our grasp, or 2 degrees has only a 5% probability, whatever that means, or if CO2 emissions have done nothing but rise, and if all of this has occurred despite the warnings of the IPCC, despite the promises and commitments of governments, despite protests, and despite the plethora of books about the Anthropocene, if all of this has happened despite all of that, it's ultimately because of the failure of individual, collective, institutional, and organizational will and intelligence. In other words, transformational readjustments of the technical and social system are always possible, but they can become impossible if the conditions of collective will and intelligence are themselves what has been undermined, depleted, or destroyed in such a process of disadjustment. What is education? This brings us to the question that truly ties the Anthropocene to education: the unsustainability of a global system that tends to destroy will and intelligence, which is to say, care, and the corresponding need to reinvent systems capable of fostering and cultivating them. It's here that the question of education becomes absolutely unavoidable, but it is here too that we require a new critique of education, starting from an acknowledgement that education too is in crisis. And to count as a critique, this means that we must first know what education is, and we must secondly know what it is for in this century that faces this headlong rush into limits. It's by asking these questions that we'll be able to understand how the question of sustainability is really the same as the question of diversity, but only on two conditions. That one, that we acknowledge that no sustainability is ever final, and two, that we know what we actually mean by this word diversity. What is education? In order to survive, many kinds of creatures must, when young, learn lessons from older members of their species. And many creatures must also learn lessons about behavior through play that amounts to the rehearsal of the survival functions they will need when no longer under parental care. Instinctive behavior, arising as a result of so-called natural selection over thousands, if not millions of generations, and recorded genetically, is therefore obviously not the whole story of animal behavior. There are latitudes in the expression of the genetic instincts of animals, and what opens a limited space of behavioral freedom is the fact that individuals of a species possess not only a genetic memory that is inherited from generation to generation, but a nervous memory, a brain capable of recording the lessons of experience, which may then become a constitutive and necessary part of the raising of individuals of that species. Nervous memory brains thus make possible new behavior by an individual who learns a lesson from their individual experience. And at least among the higher primates, it makes possible a living chain of lessons passed on from one generation to the next, as was observed among Japanese monkeys on Koshima in 1953, when for the first time a female was seen washing a sweet potato in the sea to improve its taste. An innovation disseminated to other members of the troop and transmitted from generation to generation, becoming a normal part of the learned behavior of the monkeys of that island. Should we call the transmission of this technique of washing sweet potatoes education, which is to say, are these processes that generate what is usually called culture? Perhaps we should, why not? After all, this is a modification in behavior that represents an advance in taste, hence in some way an aesthetic development. Many people understand the idea that consideration of these questions cannot any longer be a matter of opposing the animal and the human, or nature and culture. This is perhaps the key lesson of the forms of French philosophy and thinking that arose in the 1960s. But what we learned from the philosopher Bernard Stiegler, who himself learned it from André Leragaron and Alfred J. Lotka, is that it is a matter of making a distinction, not an opposition, between the transmission of lessons that rely on genetics and brains, which we can call endosomatic forms of memory, and the transmission of lessons that rely on genetics and brains and externalized supports, that is, exosomatic forms of memory. This third form of memory, exteriorized memory, begins long before humans existed and occurs in pre-human hominins as a co-evolution of brains, hands, and tools, an exosomatic evolution, so that we cannot, strictly speaking, say that one of these rather than another was the driver of this co-evolutionary process. Long before there are externalized supports dedicated to the conservation of memory and lessons, there are tools. And in fact, every tool functions, deliberately or otherwise, as a kind of memory, in the sense that, for example, a flint chopper or hand axe records the gestures of the hands that fashioned it, which means that thousands of years later, it becomes possible for researchers to relearn how to make such tools. When, much later than the commencement of stone tool production, tools do begin to be produced that are dedicated to the conservation of memory and the exteriorization of mental contents, with the painted caves of the Upper Paleolithic, then it truly begins to become possible to conserve, transmit, accumulate, and transform the lessons of experience, including lessons accumulated by those who lived many generations before my own, and to whom I may not be related by an unbroken chain of either genetic or nervous memory. This develops much further when, later still, these external supports begin to include the means of writing, which opens the possibility, for example, of the transmission of the lessons learned by the founders of geometry, and all of the other disciplines of formal knowledge that require an institutional education that we call schooling. School is essentially an institution in which, through an apprenticeship based on the frequenting of externalized repositories of accumulated past knowledge, it becomes possible to recapitulate the history of this knowledge in condensed form, so that a child can learn in a few years what took centuries or even millennia to be gathered, discovered, and invented by human beings of past epochs. What then is the relationship between this notion of education and the transmission of lessons amongst Japanese monkeys on Koshima? Or in other words, what is the same and what is different between forms of learning that are endosomatic, relying on genetics and brains, and forms of learning that are exosomatic, relying on genetics and brains and exomnasic tools? What is the same is that the conservation of the lessons of experience is the means by which life of all kinds pursues the struggle against entropy. As we learned from Erwin Schrödinger in 1943, always and everywhere, life is a singular and improbable dynamic process that locally and temporarily defers the overwhelming tendency of the physical universe, which consists in the irreversible elimination of the improbable by the probable, and the exhaustion of potential energies. While the lessons learned from the individual experience of a single organism are not conserved genetically, processes of natural selection mean that across many generations, new forms of improbability can emerge from endosomatic evolution in the form of the differentiation of new organs and species adapted to the conditions of life at that time and in that locality. The lessons learned by a single organism can indeed be conserved by that organism during its life in a brain and nervous system that possesses the ability to adapt behavior on the basis of experience. But with the death of the organism, those lessons are mostly lost to the species, notwithstanding the possibility of a continuation of certain kinds of behavior of the kind seen on Koshima. In the case of exomnasic life, the lessons of the individual member can be saved, accumulated, condensed, and developed. And ultimately, this too is a question of the means of conducting the neg-entropic struggle for existence against the overarching entropic tendency. This accumulation and development of lessons, however, makes possible the unfolding of a new, singular, and improbable process, that of the differentiation of new kinds of exosomatic organs and the knowledge of their use in the process of exosomatic evolution that characterizes the kinds of beings that we ourselves are. What is different then is that exosomatic life conducts this pursuit by means other than life, and in particular by the means of memory organs other than those of living memory. This implies both that new kinds of improbabilities open up for this form of life, the improbable futures made possible by this educated life that is a technical form of life that knows, and that it is prone to eliminate improbabilities by reducing life to new kinds of probables. The opening of exosomatic knowledge, that is, of what the Greeks called noesis, can always close, which we see with those forms of the elimination of the improbable that are the rigidity of dogma and what Nietzsche called leveling or a reduction to averages, in this way foreseeing the standardization and particularization of life and behavior made possible through the algorithmic use of big data by the platforms of computational capitalism. Whether it is a matter of dogmatization, leveling, standardization, or particularization, in each case it consists in an elimination of the improbable as knowledge is reduced to information, and in particular to computable information, tending to deprive it of its dynamic potential, which is to say, exhausting the social energy of desire that circulates across libidinal circuits, thereby undermining will, intelligence, and the possibility of opening new improbable futures. This guy is the head of the YY live streaming platform in China. He knows. Hence, there is no education that does not involve the knowledgeable practice of exomnasic retentions, which opens the possibility of every kind of exomnasic protension, if we may borrow these terms from Edmund Husserl. All education depends on exomnasic instruments, on technologies of memory. And there can be no conception of the future of education that does not take account of the evolution of these technologies and instruments. Education is an education in knowledge to the precise extent that it is an irreducibly mnemotechnological practice. Just as exomnasic techniques makes possible the accumulation and transformation of knowledge, so too knowledge is what makes possible both the development of technology and the care that must be taken, the knowledgeable care that must be taken of this dangerous supplement. Bernard Stiegler conceives this history of exomnasic or retentional technologies as a history of what he calls grammatization, a term coined by the linguist Sylvain Auroux. For Auroux, grammatization refers to the process involved in the transformation of speech, which is temporal, into writing, which is spatial. A process that, especially in the case of alphabetical writing, required the continuous temporal phenomenon of speech to be made discrete, analyzable, and reproducible as letters. But for Stiegler, grammatization is understood as the spatialization of temporal phenomena in general, and thus in fact starts much earlier than does alphabetical writing, with the materialization and exteriorization of mental contents expressed in the rupestral art I mentioned earlier, cave painting. After the invention of writing, it remains little changed for quite some time until the advent of the printing press that enables the mass printing of the Lutheran Bible that Max Weber will later describe as the origin of the spirit of capitalism in a process that turns this spiritual use of printing, which Auroux will describe as the spiritual technologies that accompanied and drove colonialism, into the profane technology of modern account books and accounting methods. Stiegler's extension of this term, however, applies not just to the grammatization of the audio-visual realm that will occur later with radio, cinema, and television, but also to the mechanical processes underlying the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. For what made that massive transformation of the technical system possible was not just a new spirit supplied by Luther's printed Bible, or the new source of energy supplied by Watt's steam engine, but also the instructions programmed into Jacquard's machine, which grammatized the gestures of the weaver, rendering them discrete, analyzable, and reproducible in the punch cards of the mechanical loom. So too, the gestures of every kind of work and tool-equipped craft would be grammatized by industrial machines, thereby creating the great 19th century division of classes between the proletariat and capital, through which the latter dispossesses the former not just of the means of production, but first and foremost of the knowledge of those means, the knowledge of how to make and do things with tools. The real meaning of proletarianization is this destruction of knowledge, effected by the exomnesic technologies of the grammatization process. Socrates had more than an inkling of this when he described writing as a pharmakon, which is to say both detrimental and beneficial for memory. But it becomes a systemic reality when industrialization makes it possible to mechanize the process, or in other words, to automate it. Hence, in the 19th century, we see the grammatization of production with the factory and the proletarianization of the knowledge of how to make. In the 20th century, we see the grammatization of consumption with marketing and the proletarianization of all the knowledge involved in customs, cultures, and ways of life. And in the 21st century, we see the grammatization of every kind of knowledge, including the formal and rational disciplines of so-called Western knowledge, and in particular, psychological, sociological, and educational research, leading to a very general proletarianization in which trust in science, and in fact in every kind of authority, has dissipated to an all-time low in an epoch often referred to for that reason as the age of post-truth. It follows from the recognition that we are exosomatic and exomnesic beings, and from the recognition that for such beings, the pursuit, accumulation, transmission, and transformation of knowledge are the very means of the pursuit of life, that there has never been and there never will be any form of education for exosomatic beings that is not, in one way or another, an instrumented education. Schooling will always be a technological process. The history of education largely reflects the history of these instruments, the history of the retentional systems utilizing technologies of grammatization through which relationships between teachers and pupils are always mediated. There can thus be no good future for education that does not pass through the consideration of the knowledgeable practice of the instruments with which teachers and students will be equipped in 2030, 2050 and beyond. Nevertheless, the key word here is knowledgeable. Being exosomatic and exomnasic beings, we always need knowledge, but we can always lose knowledge. We can always find ourselves falling prey to or getting caught up in one or another process of proletarianization. There is absolutely no reason to assume that just because a technology is new, it will necessarily be better than a technology that is old for this or that end, for example, educating children, or will not bring new and potentially greater problems. And certainly there's no reason to assume automatically that the new should replace the old, that the computer or the iPad should replace the blackboard or the textbook or the notebook, or that AI should replace those things. Any attempt to take up new tools that fails to carefully consider the pharmacological character of these instruments, that is, the possibility and in fact the necessity that they will not only enable education but also poison it, any attempt that does not also try to take care to minimize this poisonous aspect of education, especially in a 21st century in which these instruments are immeasurably more powerful than ever before, but where this also means potentially more powerfully toxic. Any attempt to take up new tools in education that does not do these things is bound to produce a crisis in education. And this is precisely what has happened to education over the course of the past several decades. What has made it possible? In taking care of youth and the generations, Stiegler makes a distinction between programming institutions, which are the social organizations of mass learning that arose in Europe in the 19th century, operating at that time mainly with the retentional system of writing and made possible by the large-scale printing of textbooks, and programming industries, which are what Adorno referred to as the culture industries, emerging in the 20th century and which Stiegler understands as organizations of mass unlearning, operating mainly with the retentional systems associated with the grammatization of the audiovisual. Whereas programming institutions have the function of taking care of the transmission of knowledge and the cultivation of care for this knowledge in succeeding generations, a care that makes possible the continuation and transformation of this knowledge, the goal of the programming industries is to short-circuit the programming institutions, to capture the attention of young minds, and to divert this attention from the long-term, if not infinite, desire for knowledge and towards the short-term, if not instantaneous, satisfactions of consumption. However much such satisfactions may dwindle, leading to an addictive spiral that can only accelerate processes of proletarianization. Yet, at the time when the programming institutions first began to be confronted with this battle for the minds and spirits of young people, these institutions themselves, to a large extent, failed to recognize the scale of this war and the power of the weapons directed against them. A war was and is being conducted against education by the use of audiovisual grammatization in the service of marketing directed at capturing youthful attention and undermining any identification with older generations, and where adolescent rebellion is itself really a mechanism for negotiating the shift from primary identification to adulthood. But instead of recognizing this war and prosecuting it, educational institutions tended rather to act as if it could be won by a strategy of capitulation. Symptoms of this failure at the level of schools are the increasing acceptance of the idea that attention to teachers, subjects, and tasks is something that can be bought only by the means of the culture industry, with lights, sounds, action, changes of scene, PowerPoint slides by the billion, or that only literature deemed relevant to the assumed everyday lives of students is worthy of or capable of receiving their attention, or that only mathematics problems that relate to the context of those lives could ever not be boring. In one way or another, such symptoms are reflections of the more general war conducted by marketing to displace parents and teachers as prescribers for young people and precisely to invert the relationship between the generations. on this score. Rather than seeing education as a process with the potential to enchant students by opening up past worlds or worlds of the unfamiliar or the abstract, thereby making possible the eventual discovery and invention of new worlds, this kind of attitude and approach begins with the assumption that attention is always on the verge of being lost, because students will always naturally be attracted to the proliferation of available distractions, that the worlds of past culture and knowledge are mostly dead, and that it is only by appealing to the already familiar that such a loss can ever hope to be prevented, loss of attention. Faced with the systematic attempt to capture attention and to eradicate its deep modes in favor of the hyper, such an approach to education only accelerates the process by offering less and less that is worthy of attention. We must, on the contrary, begin by recognizing that all culture is composed of, or is a compost of, dead worlds memorialized in exomnasic artifacts, and that it is solely on the basis of this humus, this noetic necromass, as Stiegler calls it, that new worlds of knowledge and culture can ever be fertilized. To participate in this erasure of the past is to conclude in the elimination of time. That is, in the elimination of the possibility of forming a cohesive epoch, an epoch that knows. Michel Foucault's great influence on social thought really begins with the publication of Discipline and Punish, which analyzes Bentham's panopticon in order to understand how the perpetual possibility of being under surveillance is exploited in order to cause prisoners to internalize the repressive imperatives of the authoritarian institution, thereby disciplining their behavior. This analysis thus pays close attention to the technologies of bodily submission, but far less to the technologies of writing that form the basis of schooling as the noetic admission to collective knowledge, nor again to those later grammatization technologies that will be exploited by marketing and consumerist capitalism, less repressively than regressively. Nevertheless, Foucault's account of the prison will be taken up in later research with and without Foucault and applied to many other kinds of institutions, leading to the notion of disciplinary society, an undoubtedly fruitful concept by which it becomes possible to understand the authoritarian and repressive tendencies that any social organization can find itself inhabited by. Yet if one is an authority, does this necessarily imply that one is either authoritarian or repressive? In the case of schools, we must not forget that the word discipline has at least three meanings. One, the disciplining of bodies and behavior analyzed by Foucault. Two, the disciplines of knowledge, the desire for which and the capability for which is acquired through education. And three, the self-discipline necessary to pay attention to these objects of knowledge. In short, the question of discipline in education is really the question of attention. And this is why Stiegler writes, in the school analyzed by Foucault as a surveillance system, it is not a matter of forming attention. But what Foucault completely neglects here is the role of the teacher who is charged with forming it through a discipline that is not that of surveillance, but that of integration into the circuits of transindividuation, governed not by norms, but by concepts. Attention is by no means a natural faculty of the human being. The human ability and need to pay attention to objects detached from what for animals would be their instincts, or in other words, the human capacity to invest in objects of desire of all kinds, including those that form the protensional capacity that is called will, and especially in those objects of knowledge that are subjects of knowledge, must always be cultivated, starting from the attention that parents must know how to pay to their children. This is why Kant begins his lectures on pedagogy by stating that the human being is the only creature that must be educated, and why he distinguishes the needs of animals for food, warmth, and so on, from the additional need of those exosomatic organisms that are human children for a form of care that he understands as the precaution of the parents that children not make any harmful use of their powers. For Kant, it is already the case that this need for education arises from the fact that the human being is without instinct. An animal is already all that it can be because of its instinct. A foreign intelligence has already taken care of everything for it. But the human being needs his own intelligence. He has no instinct and must work out the plan of his conduct for himself. Discipline prevents the human being from deviating by means of his animal impulses from his destiny, humanity. No doubt we would not say exactly this in exactly this way today. In Stiglerian terms, it is not a matter of being with or without instinct. It is not a matter of opposing instinct to human freedom or destiny, but of the advent of an exosomatic organism whose instincts, or rather drives, can, precisely because of his exosomatic origin, be detached from their aims and reattached to other aims, including to objects that do not exist, yet consist, all those objects of desire that are the ideas. In any case, whether Kant understands that or not, for Kant, it is precisely this need for care and formation that means that children are sent to school initially, not already with the intention that they should learn something there, but rather that they may grow accustomed to sitting still and observing punctually what they are told, so that in the future they may not put into practice actually and instantly each notion that strikes them. This is less a matter of disciplinary submission in the Foucauldian sense than the organological formation of bodily habits as a preliminary attentional condition of so much education. What must be added here is that even and perhaps especially in these first preparatory steps, where the instruments may be only a desk or a floor, in the case of a dance class, for example, this seemingly almost mechanical discipline must, in fact, if it is to succeed, always be accompanied by, or rather consists of, a process that simultaneously enchants, in Winnicott's sense, the world of the child, so that he or she will in one way or another be led to invest themselves in such a cultivation of attention, which is to say, find themselves protensionally directed, wanting to project their noetic and libidinal energies towards a further pursuit of the material and spiritual rewards made possible by the continued cultivation of attention and knowledge. Far from being antithetical to care, discipline would in this way be its very character and condition. And we should recall that a few pages after observing that education begins with learning to become accustomed to sitting still, Kant concludes that to have trained one's children to think is not enough. Oh, we missed the slide. Rather, what really matters is that they learn to think. This is Kant. What really matters is they learn to think, italicized. All of this adds up to a conclusion not so far removed from that reached by a young Fran Lebowitz, which she expresses in the form of a piece of humorous advice for 17-year-olds. Think before you speak, read before you think. This will give you something to think about that you didn't make up yourself, a wise move at any age, but most especially at 17, when you're in the greatest danger of coming to annoying conclusions. Critical thinking is no doubt one of the most worthwhile capacities to cultivate in young people living in a society in crisis. But what is very often forgotten is that critical thinking must always be accompanied by a capacity for care, itself equally in need of cultivation. This latter capacity depends on entering a process that generates an individual and collective ability to love the world rather than hate it, a love that would be opened up and enchanted by a care-filled educational process. That includes being able to sit still. One crucial aspect of the generation of such love and care is for teachers and institutions to know how to enchant students with a love of knowledge, and more specifically with the knowledge contained in disciplines. Education systems must produce teachers capable of such generation and give them the means of cultivating these virtues. How then should we think these twin imperatives? The necessity of instilling even the most basic aspects of attention formation, such as being able to sit still and listen, and the necessity of fostering the ability to think, as Kant italicizes it, or, and this really amounts to the same thing, the ability to care, as Stiegler will often italicize it. The model of the disciplinary society lifted from prison and applied as a heuristic with which to critique schooling tends to oppose these two imperatives. The disciplining of bodies in educational institutions automates behavioral responses and thereby dulls the capacity for the freedom to think. But this opposition of the automatic and the autonomous is precisely what can in no way be maintained by any coherent picture of the educational process. All of life depends on the maintenance of automatisms. From the perpetually maintained rhythms of the cardiovascular system to the automatic reflex that shrinks from pain. Automatism is the condition of life itself. Feedback loops are what define the negentropic systems of endosomatic life, and these are precisely automatisms. In exosomatic life, however, the automatisms in play are not limited to instinctual loops, but rather extend to all kinds of non-biological automatisms, which must be learned, and which, in the form of the spirals of knowledge rather than the loops of instinct, make possible the disautomatization of human behavior. Such disautomatization being that to which autonomy has always really amounted. This is why Stiegler could write, "The noetic brain is essentially the organ capable of acquiring automatisms. Reading, writing, counting, playing football, playing the violin, or playing like Diderot's actor, and of thus conquering something as an autonomy, the possibility of being a great actor, as the anamnesic power to disautomatize by starting again each time from the originary default of all knowledge that always precedes me, just as the past of Dasein has always preceded it. To practice scales at the piano or memorize multiplication tables in early primary mathematics, far from being the repressive disciplining of the musical body or the mathematical mind, are in fact crucial early steps along the road towards the disautomatization necessary to be a great or even a good musician or mathematician, which is to say not a bad one, who does behave only automatically. These automatisms precisely freeing up the mind and giving it the space to be occupied with something else, that is, with the possibility of playing, composing, thinking, or reasoning. When educational theory and practice abandons the knowledge of the necessity of automatisms or replaces them with technological automatisms, such as allowing programmable scientific calculators to replace the internalization of the ability to solve more complex problems in later secondary mathematics, and does so in the name of the most vacuous concept of freedom, when it unthinkingly embraces the notion of allowing the child the freedom to explore, free of such disciplining, and conjoins this to the ideology of resilience and adaptability, it does nothing more than conform to the emptiest neoliberal paradigm while simultaneously allowing the utter destruction of the educational process that such a neoliberalism demands. Consequently, it's no surprise that so often the pathways promised by this kind of eviscerated pseudo-education prove to be mirages and dead ends. Maybe, I'm on the last section. Should I just read it or skip a couple of paragraphs?
perhaps skip a couple of paragraphs or just
Okay.
explain them. Yeah.
What I say is that diversity is always a diversity of knowledge and a diversity of reason, and not a diversity of identities. And then my conclusion is, in this sense, the rise or re-rise of identitarian conceptions of social existence must be understood as symptoms of the failure of education and the failure of contemporary society in general to know how to navigate the complexities and diversities of the psychic, collective, and technical individuation processes of contemporary life, in an age when the third of these seems destined to overwhelm the first two, thereby also eliminating the possibility of its own continuation. Such a symptom is itself only one of many arising from a condition of no longer knowing how to care. And in particular, how to take care of intergenerational relations. In a time where this destruction of the ability to know what to do about the raising of children leads adults, as Bernard Stiegler has said, to themselves behave like children. Marketing also systemically infantilizing them, that is, depriving them of their autonomy. This inability and infantility produce what Bernard Stiegler and Greta Thunberg both condemn: an immense regression, a generalized irresponsibility of adult generations, both in relation to the fostering of a sustainable diversality of reason and in relation to the protection of the conditions of a sustainable biodiversity. For Stiegler, Greta Thunberg was a sign, herself a positive symptom of a possibility, however improbable, but where this depends also on the education of Thunberg and her generation, even though she asked the question of whether she should be in school. That is, on our duty to try and draw them out towards the open questions that have thus far failed to materialize on center stage, those of the conditions of the deproletarianization and the re-noetization without which no decarbonization will ever be achieved. Will and intelligence, both individual and collective, have their conditions. As long as educators and policymakers continue to push or be pushed towards adapting education to the solutions offered by global technologies, so long as these educators and policymakers and all of us fail adequately to address both, one, the problems caused by the massive computerization and marketization of primary, secondary, and tertiary education, and two, the question of if and how grammatization technologies could contribute to disautomatization, rather than tending to eliminate everything that cannot be reduced to calculable information. The dates of 2030 and 2050 are bound to be merely further milestones along the road of collective failure. One more paragraph. To counter these problems and raise these questions in theory and in practice is possible, however, only on the condition of massive investment in research aimed at addressing them. Research whose premises must not be those that have presided over the educational capitulation to which I've tried to draw your attention here, and must be those that make possible a bifurcation towards the regeneration of a new wealth of reasons capable of giving us the reason in all senses of the word to act. Bernard Stiegler argued that the unsustainability of the current macroeconomic system confronts us with the challenge of finding ways of opening a new dynamic leading past this system, and he shows that this depends on the invention of new computational instruments specifically designed to foster a diversity of knowledge, and through that to make possible genuinely contributory research processes capable of fueling such a dynamic. Only if Greta Thunberg's more than tragic parasia, expressed in the phrase, "How dare you," can in this manner meet up with Kant's injunction, "Dare to think," could we ever dream of opening up a careful but urgent pathway beyond the blocked horizon whose name has become the Anthropocene. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very rich presentation. And there were many themes taken in, and a lot to think about. I think while people are thinking what they would like to ask you about, then I might start out with a few questions. First, the first one concerns what you call the war in the education. To put it, go directly to the point here, uh, uh, which is you have this distinction between the two, the cultural industry and then the institutions, the educational institutions from the 19th century. And as far as I heard you, then it is like, and also you have the whole thing, the Kantian approach, and there's also something with regard to Foucault we will leave alone for the time being. But could you elaborate a little more about these two, the difference between these two institutions, and what do you think, now being, very instrumentalist, how does that affect how we do educational institutions today, or we should do educational institutions today? This thing, because as I heard you, then and that has obviously also something to do with the concept of knowledge. But as I heard you, the 19th century institution in a way supported knowledge, which was not the case so much with the cultural industry. That was a brief version of it. So
Yeah.
how would that influence how we think of large educational institutions today? Now we are sitting I'm sitting at a University of Applied Science. A lot of people are sitting at a large institution around the world. What are we going to do about this? Is this should we continue with this? Should we mixture? What do you think about what would the impact be on the concrete institutions today if we take up your lead on these things?
Okay. Well, as we know, of course, mass education is not a very old phenomenon.
Hmm.
And it arises really with the needs of capitalism and so on. And it arises with a national agenda, which is the beginning of, national testing and all of that, that becomes subject of the kind of critique that Foucault wants to make. And no doubt there are some connections between the disciplining that Foucault sees in the panopticonical prison and the repressive aspects of schooling in the past, especially. But it's important to know which battles to fight and which battles not to fight. What are the real battles of today? And is it the repressiveness of institutions that is really our problem today? And I would say, no. The problems we face politically, institutionally, educationally are no longer fundamentally, primarily those of repression, but those of regression. About those 19th century institutions, like I said, the main grammatization technology they operated with was writing. And this is what Foucault does not really address, which is funny considering that he then later considers that self-writing is the mechanism of something like a real autonomy. Writing is a pharmacon. It has a poisonous side, but it has a very positive side that education institutions have taken advantage of with the printing press and the mass publication of textbooks that opens up all kinds of possibilities of knowledge. A war is conducted means that the culture industries are in competition with those educational institutions. And you have to recognize that competition. And what they're competing for is attention, the attention of young people, not only young people, but especially young people, and systematically and powerfully. And in the 21st century, those means are also algorithmic, not just TV. TV is still important, but all kinds of screens and algorithmic processes and so on. It doesn't mean that computation, screens, even AI, whatever, cannot have a positive educational role. I'm not saying that it's not possible. What I'm saying is that only a very careful analysis can tell you in what ways you're poisoning and in what ways you're adding. And what I feel about educational research is that there's a lot of celebration and very little attention to the question of what are the costs, what are the harms. So that's two separate issues. One is the competition, and the other is that the capitulation is to accept that we must take up the same weapons for our own side. And the challenge is, okay, at certain levels, at the beginning of primary school, there should be no computers. At the university, obviously, it's a completely different question. But still, then the question becomes, what use of technologies genuinely promotes a diversity of reason and knowledge? And Stiegler's answer to that question would be, for example, annotation technologies that make it possible to have more dimensions of noetically responding to, say, a video, by turning it again into a writing thing, by annotating it, and then by this annotation becoming collective, so that it opens up a kind of new knowledgeable practice. But the condition for that is to have practices, not just to introduce the technology, but to introduce technology, taking the care to develop and implement the practices that will make that a cultivator of knowledge rather than a destroyer. And for that, you need the capacity to cultivate attention.
Okay, thank you. It's a really interesting issue, how to consider the retention processes in this and the aesthetics of this. There is a question now from Ben, who has written a question, and which is, I don't know why I can see myself totally now on the screen. Maybe Mark can tell me. Yeah, okay, that's good. But the question is, what would the key distinctions be between the so-called entrepreneurship and contributory economy that Stiegler proposed in his last works? And it seems that Dan is very familiar with Stiegler's work here. So Ben is very familiar with Stiegler's work. So maybe, did Stiegler make this distinction? How do you do it? And maybe you will start then with introducing what Stiegler did, and then we'll take it from there.
Yes. One of the big problems in education is the openness to being colonized by technology companies that present them with solutions, programs, packages, and so on, that then they take on board without nearly enough critical attention. And by contributory processes, what Stiegler means is the necessity of having computational systems that make it possible for a contribution of knowledge to occur that's not just the kind of voluntary crowdsourcing of knowledge that doesn't truly depend on the diversity of knowledge in the first place. An example of that is Wikipedia. And it's an example of a contributory process. Yeah. It's one where all the past encyclopedias of the world suddenly became obsolete, which doesn't mean that they may not be superior in some aspects, but they're not superior computationally, and they're also not superior contributorily. The system is designed in order for a diversity of knowledge to be accumulated and can lead to transformations. The issue is to do that in institutions and in other ways. What's also interesting about Wikipedia, of course, is that it is not for profit. And this is a great distinction between it and informational platforms that gather up even more information than Wikipedia does, but not in order to set up a contest of knowledge. For instance, in all of the rational disciplines are based on a criticism of peers, that is a contest of knowledge. With ideas like open science and so on, they can either, or let's say academia.edu, that everybody knows. It can either be structured in a way that tends to set up that contest of peers, or it can be structured in a way that tends to turn it into a Facebook type platform that is based not on a real contest of knowledge, but on likes, and it really reduces that to information, which is more what it tends to do. Obviously, things are a mix. What Stiegler is saying is that we don't know how to do that at the university level and at the social level in a general way. But we must become able to do it because the platforms that we are in competition with have all the best engineers working on capturing all of our attention.
Okay. Thank you. And I think this was a really enlightening thing about the contributory. It was a very good question, and I think it enlightened a lot of things. Also, the participatory aspects of this and the aesthetics and involved in it, and how things had to be built to deal with these things. Now we are closing in on nearly at the end of our session, and I would like to thank you once more, Dan, because I think this is a session which we will record it and we will play it again, and I think people will have something to think about. It was very inspirational. I also think also to take now a really practical point, the point that beware not just to buy into the cultural industry as educational institution. That might be a sound advice here at the end. And there is a question, one final question from Torben. I think he's sitting in Chile, so we are as long from each other as we can be, but thanks to the marvels of modern technology, we can still talk together. So could you, Torben, ask, and this is a brief, and could you ask briefly, because we are getting close to the end of the session, could you comment on the role of original people in these possibilities, please? And I think not only in your traditional school systems of the 19th centuries, but also the focus on original people, indigenous people, whatever you call it. What would be your take on this?
Well, all of the peoples of the world are subject to proletarianization processes. And this means that they have knowledge which is being lost. And when I say knowledge, it's not just a question of academic knowledge or rational knowledge, but it's also not just a question of this plant that has this property and so on. It's a question of knowledge of ways of living. And that knowledge is a great diversity. As soon as you begin to study anthropology, you see that great diversity of ways of living. But that too can be extremely fragile when faced with the proletarianization processes of the culture industries and other destructive forces. And today, in many, many societies, those kinds of knowledge are already destroyed, including in Australia. And what's destroyed is almost impossible to bring back. You can turn it into a museum, but it's almost impossible to bring back. And nevertheless, in places where technology has not penetrated in the same way as it has in the West, there is a retention of the knowledge of the ability to live, to cook, to eat, to raise children, all of the things that that form the fabric of life. It's not a question of which ways are better, but it is a question of discerning, judging the processes that cause those forms of knowledge to be lost. And this leads to many great contradictions between modernity and tradition and so on. But that loss is one that is exactly like the loss of biodiversity. What's lost can never come back. And that's because the retentional processes that keep these memories, in case of biodiversity, genetic retentional processes, and in the case of exosomatic life, human life, in not just in books, in artifacts, in all kinds of tools and retentional systems. Once it goes, it's not the thing itself is what carries it, but it's the knowledge of the practices that accompany those tools that gives the life and the cohesion to ways of living that that are fundamentally what it means to have a diversity of knowledge and reason. We lose them at our peril.
Thank you. I think this is a fitting way to end, and also to think there might be a good point in why UNESCO are talking about futures of education, the various forms of life which should not be lost, and how could that we establish forms of retention which will secure that this was not to happen. So this has been a very interesting presentation. I'm very happy that you joined us, Dan. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you. So with these words, we will end this. We're a little about time, past time, but not much. But with these words, we will end this session. Thank you, Dan. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Pleasure.
Bye.